We always knew the ending of Little Red Riding Hood well. The wolf would swallow the grandmother and the girl, but then the hunter would come, slit open his stomach, and rescue them both. Do you think that's a happy ending? That's just one version of the tale. In another version, the wolf eats the girl and the story simply ends. No ending to speak of. On top of that, we see deeply disturbing references to sexual abuse. Or in yet another version, before eating the girl, the wolf prepares a meal for her and cunningly feeds her her own grandmother's flesh and makes her drink her blood. Yes, you heard that right. That's exactly what happens. What was the purpose of all these traumatizing versions? Is this how a children's story should be? Perhaps this tale was never written for children in the first place. I think there is no one who doesn't know or hasn't heard of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is on her way to visit her ailing grandmother, and before she sets out, her mother gives her a serious warning. Don't talk to strangers in the forest and go straight to your grandmother's house. But the little girl, in her naivety, or rather foolishness, doesn't listen to her mother's advice. She encounters a hungry and wild wolf in the forest. At first, the wolf wants to eat her right then and there, but since there is a hunter nearby, he abandons that idea. Instead, he begins to chat with the girl. The foolish girl trusts this wolf and tells him everything about herself. She even tells him where her grandmother lives. The wolf's cunning mind goes to work, and he realizes that if his plan goes as hoped, he can devour both the girl and the grandmother. After parting from the girl, the wolf goes straight to the grandmother's house and swallows the old woman in a single bite. He then disguises himself in the grandmother's clothes to deceive the girl. When the girl arrives, she mistakes the wolf for her grandmother. But just as she begins to suspect that the person before her is a wolf, the wolf swallows her too. The hunter in the forest notices that the door to the grandmother's house is open, and upon entering, finds the wolf sleeping in the bed. He understands what has happened. He immediately cuts open the wolf's stomach with his scissors and rescues the grandmother and the girl, who are still alive. He fills the wolf's open belly with stones and sews it back up, and the wolf dies shortly after waking. The grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood are saved, and all of this has taught the girl a good lesson. She must not trust strangers, because she is surrounded by wolves who want to take advantage of her. This story also resembles our own lives in a way. People who are naive and cannot say no are constantly and mercilessly used by the cunning people around them. This is the most popular version of Little Red Riding Hood, and it was written in the 19th century by the Brothers Grimm. Of course, these brothers did not invent this tale from scratch. They blended several versions from previous years to create this story. So let's go back to the very beginning. Let's go back 1,000 years and try to understand this tale from the start. In the 10th century, a folk tale began gaining popularity in Europe, particularly in the Italian region. La finta nonna, the false grandmother. First of all, in this story the girl does not wear a red hood. The tale refers to her simply as a little girl. The second difference is that our villain is described not as a wolf, but as a hairy giant or creature. The general outline of the story is similar. While on her way to visit her grandmother, the girl meets the creature. The creature arrives at the grandmother's house before the girl and swallows her. But it hasn't eaten the grandmother's entire body. It has set aside some of her flesh and blood, because it plans to serve these to the girl. The girl arrives and thinks the creature is her grandmother. When she says, "I'm hungry, grandmother," the creature prepares the real grandmother's flesh and blood as if it were a normal meal and gives it to her. The girl eats it without realizing. Afterwards, the creature moves to the bed and asks the girl to get in with her. At this point, it has tied the girl to a rope and is controlling her like a leash. The girl gets into bed but realizes that the one before her is not her grandmother but a creature. She needs to flee the house without letting on, so she tells the creature she needs to use the toilet. The creature says, "You can relieve yourself right here in the bed. I'm serious, go ahead." The girl insists that it's too much for the bed and eventually manages to get permission from the creature to use the toilet. The creature feels at ease because it trusts the leash rope it tied to the girl. But the girl doesn't go to the toilet. She first unties her leash, ties the rope to a tree, and runs from the house with all her might. The creature notices the girl has escaped and gives chase. Fortunately, it cannot catch her, and our story ends with the girl saving her own life. Even though she survives, we certainly cannot call this a happy ending. The creature has killed the grandmother and, on top of that, fed the grandmother to the girl. About 700 years after this folktale, a poet named Charles Perrault thinks this story needs a new variation and makes significant changes. For one, he puts a red hood on the girl and specifically notes that she is a beautiful girl. Perrault has a reason for choosing red as the color of the hood. After all, the color red can variously represent danger, desire, the loss of innocence, or sexuality. And Perrault wanted to explore precisely these themes in his version. He also designs the villain not as a creature, but as a wolf. This is a more concrete and more believable idea. Let's skip the common parts we've already described. The wolf, having swallowed the grandmother, moves to the bed and waits for the girl to arrive. The girl comes to the house and mistakes the wolf for her grandmother. And the wolf says to the girl, "Take off your clothes and get into bed." Yes, that is exactly what he says. The girl does as the wolf says. She takes off her clothes and gets into bed. But it isn't long before she notices that this being she took for her grandmother is extremely hairy and has a tail. But by then, it is too late. Before she can escape, the wolf swallows her, and the story ends there. Yes, this variation has a bad ending. No hunter or anyone else comes to save the girl and the grandmother. In Perrault's version, the wolf is not merely a hungry animal. He is also a pervert who wishes to sexually abuse this girl. This variation is at least as disturbing as the cannibalistic version. Moreover, the girl looking at the wolf and noticing the hair on his body and his tail has been interpreted by some as the girl seeing a man's body, with the tail representing the male sexual organ. Perrault's tale naturally becomes the center of controversy. The poet, however, states that he designed it to be this striking and disturbing precisely to convey his message effectively. He explains the message of his tale as follows. Children, especially beautiful young girls, if they make this mistake, they could become that wolf's dinner. I say wolf, but there are different kinds of wolves. Some are charismatic, kind, sweet, and they pursue young girls on the streets and in their homes. And unfortunately, the truly polite wolves are the dangerous ones. Members of organizations that want to lure young girls into certain groups and abuse them first try to present themselves as ideal and capable men. They use every resource at their disposal to appear rich, intelligent, and successful. And in the process, just as Perrault said, they deceive the girls in their sights with their polite masks and sweet words. They exploit the good intentions of girls by saying things like, "I want to marry you, I'll introduce you to my mother, no one like you has ever come into my life." All lies. From this perspective, we can say that Perrault, in writing his version, wrote the most realistic one in terms of exposing the true nature of the wolves we encounter in real life. And Perrault sums up these outwardly sweet-seeming wolves in a single phrase: "The sweetest tongues hide the sharpest teeth." You are in the forest at night, trying to reach your grandmother. At the same time, you need to escape from the wolf. There are, by the way, a few horror games based on the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, but none of them have achieved much success. If any of you are involved in game development, you might try your luck with this tale's concept. It's not a bad story for a game. Let's return to our tale. We've talked about two versions. The first is the 10th century cannibal version. The second is the 17th century perverted version. And these versions were too heavy, not just for children, but even for adults. How could cannibalism and abuse be discussed when reading a bedtime story to a child? Well, these tales carried a message both for children and for parents. Just as children should not trust strangers, a parent should not send their small child alone into a dangerous forest. In the 19th century, the Brothers Grimm wanted to publish a book of fairy tales aimed not at an audience of both adults and children, but at children alone. The main message of the story would of course remain the same: don't trust strangers. But in this children-only version, the Brothers Grimm could not include sexual abuse or cannibalism. They removed these parts from the tale outright. The wolf was transformed from a pervert or cannibal into simply a hungry animal looking to fill its stomach. You'll surely remember that iconic dialogue between the wolf and the girl in this tale. "Grandmother, why do you have such big ears?" "All the better to hear you with." "And what big eyes you have." "All the better to see you with." "Grandmother, what big hands you have." "All the better to hold you with." "And what a big throat you have." "All the better to eat you with." Yes, this is a very well-written piece of dialogue. A child hearing it for the first time cannot possibly fail to flinch when that last line comes. Look at how the tale of Little Red Riding Hood has been softened step by step. It started out with a cannibal and a pervert, and ultimately transformed into nothing more than a hungry animal. By the way, the expression wolf has been used for centuries to describe serial abusers, men who see women and girls as prey to be taken to bed and who abuse them in succession. And the most famous of these is the case of Peter Stump, a German farmer from the 16th century, who was a serial killer. Peter had committed acts of sexual assault, murder, and cannibalism against more than 10 women and children in the area where he lived. When captured, he claimed to be a werewolf working in league with the devil. This event caused widespread uproar, and some rulers in medieval Europe, much like witch hunts, began hunting people who claimed to be werewolves, and courts were established. Peter was captured in 1589 and sentenced to a tortured death as a public spectacle. His flesh was torn off with red-hot pincers. His bones were broken, his head was severed, and finally, this severed head was hung in the town square on a wooden post topped with a wolf figure for all to see. It is thought that Charles Perrault drew inspiration from this Peter Stump case when designing Little Red Riding Hood and choosing a wolf as the villain. Thanks to events like these, the wolf as an animal became an expression embedded in common speech, used to describe men who trick young girls and seek to take advantage of them. To give a more recent example, I mentioned this in my Marilyn Monroe video, when Marilyn talked about how cunningly the producers in the Hollywood industry had developed tactics to sleep with her. She used the term wolves for these men. She even published an article titled "Wolves I Have Known" to warn young girls new to the industry. So, as you can see, we're talking about a metaphor that has persisted for years. We compare serial abusers to the wolf. The fact that it is a predatory animal certainly plays a role. But there are other predatory animals after all. A bear or a tiger? Why not? Deliberately, a wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, like many children's fairy tales, is a story that originated in the West, and it is nearly impossible for a story originating in the West to be uninfluenced by Christianity. Before moving on to the concept of the wolf in Christianity, let's first look at the concept of the sheep in this religion. In the book of Matthew, Jesus says that on Judgment Day, people will be divided into two groups, those going to heaven and those going to hell. And in making this distinction, he uses the metaphor of a shepherd. Just as a shepherd separates his sheep from his goats, Jesus will also separate the devout from the sinners. In the Psalms, there is the expression, "The Lord is my shepherd." According to this metaphor in Christianity, if God is a shepherd, then the people who believe in God and follow him are sheep. In other words, sheep in Christianity represent the people who walk the path of God. And one of the animals that shepherds have always feared throughout history has been wolves, the wolves that prey on sheep. In Christianity, the wolf represents humanity's straying from God and drawing closer to the devil. And in many parts of the Bible, when speaking of devilish and sinful people, the wolf metaphor is used. Beware of false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Her princes within her are like wolves tearing their prey. They shed blood and kill people to make unjust gain. So the greatest factor behind the wolves having such a villainous reputation is what the wolf represents in Christianity. Now we understand why the villain in Little Red Riding Hood was chosen specifically to be a wolf, and not some other animal. Let's go back to the Brothers Grimm's version. Throughout the video, we haven't focused much on this version. The Brothers Grimm's tale is by far the most reasonable and least traumatic. After all, it ends happily, and the hunter kills the wolf. Why did these brothers choose such an ending? Was their only aim to make the tale more suitable for children? No. In fact, by designing such an ending, the Brothers Grimm were trying to tell us something. The point is not merely to escape from the wolf. Let's return to the other two versions. Alongside their own particular horrors, these versions leave us unsettled and troubled by the wolf's survival, because we know that this wolf is still out there somewhere, continuing to hunt other girls. A story in which Little Red Riding Hood only escapes from the wolf remains incomplete. For this story to be complete, one must confront that wolf.